Oh boy, here we go, one of the big ones. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today, I'm talking about the new album from The Orb, No Sounds Are Out of Bounds. Wanted to wait until I got the CD for this one, but I don't think that's gonna come for a while. And then the CD actually came after I finished recording the review and started editing it already, so what have you. Also came with this thing of instrumentals as well, but I probably don't really need that because I like the vocal versions more. The Orb, that's Dr. Alex Patterson and whoever's working with him at any given time. Usually Thomas Fellman, though I believe this time around he's working more closely with Youth, aka Martin Glover, and also Michael Rendall, Gowdy, and many others who, some of which I will talk about here. And yeah, I don't really think The Orb need any introduction on this channel at this point. I've covered them a couple of times before, first near the beginning of this channel's life with their Moonbuilding 2703 AD album, then again in 2016 with their COW/Chill Out World album, and then a third time in 2017 with their Sin in Space Part 3 remix EP, which I probably wouldn't have covered if not for the fact they contacted me themselves with a free download, which I still can't believe that actually happened, like holy crap. I'll link all three of my previous Orb videos in the description, but obviously they have quite the illustrious career that stretches back to the early 90s. And I've been a big fan of theirs since my early high school years, one of my all-time favorite bands for sure. They have several albums I would definitely go out of my way to recommend. I'm not going to do the in brief segment again for this video since I already did it on the other two reviews I did for them. Again, you can check out those if you want more detailed thoughts on their back catalog. I plan on doing a series on their other stuff later down the line too, so I can cover them in more detail. But if you haven't already checked out any of their other stuff, definitely start with their first album, Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld, which is a classic. And my other big personal favorite is The Dream, which came later on in their career. I know I've seen some mixed thoughts on that one since it was a little out of the ordinary for them, but I love that whole thing. Spoilers, we're going to be talking about that one a little more in this review as well. Runners-up for me include Orbis, Terrarum, UF Orb, and Cydonia, all excellent albums in my opinion. Now, more recently, we've had the Moonbuilding album, which I personally loved and still do, having sounded like an evolution of the Orb sound into some new and intriguing territory. And then Chill Out World, I liked that one too, but I was a little less enthusiastic over it. I found the experience to be, while on one hand quite stimulating, also on the forgettable side. I remember saying that I appreciated there was a lot of work and attention to detail put into it. For their next album, I personally wanted something that popped out more, something that was more energetic. Enter this album, No Sounds Are Out of Bounds, which from some iTunes previews I heard of teaser singles and other articles talking about it, it sounded like this album was more or less setting out to directly address my problems with their last one. As I said, Thomas Fellman wasn't really working on this one as much. He's on a couple of tracks. But I also read an article that said he decided not to play live with the Orb anymore, which, that's a shame, but whatever. And now Youth was going to be working more on this one, and on top of that, this album was just going to have a lot of collaborations in general, and the last Orb album that worked more closely with Youth, and was this collaboration heavy, was The Dream. And like I said, that's my second favorite Orb album. Needless to say, this got me excited, so, what did we get with No Sounds Are Out of Bounds? We got a lot. I expected this album to be completely nuts, and it certainly was, though not quite in the way I expected. This album seems to take cues from basically every Orb album to date. For some dub-heavy stuff that reminds me of UF Orb, to changing and evolving beat soundscapes of Moonbuilding, to vocal pop like The Dream, psychedelic elements like those of Orblivion and even Orbis Terrarum, and overall spaciness that matches adventures beyond the Ultraworld, and a couple of other random elements that don't seem pulled from any previous Orb album, leading to a complete scattered mess that I basically loved from start to finish. Much like Cydonia, actually. Given how this album is kind of messy and tries to do so many things at once, on top of its heavy borrowing from elements in basically all of their previous albums with not that many new ideas, I can see this being kind of a controversial entry in their discography, but again, this kind of album is why I love the Orb. It's crazy, sure, I knew it was going to be already, but it's also quite atmospheric and immersive. I got more emotional value out of it than I thought I would. I saw the phrase heavy but humorous used to describe this album. I think that's about it on the nose. And I think it personally manages to get all of these random elements to work together in a unique and consistently enjoyable enough way that it all just works for me. So yeah, let's talk about individual tracks now. Oh boy, there's a ton to unpack here. I guess we start at the beginning with our opener, The End of the End. I see what you did there. I don't think this is necessarily the best of tone setters for this album, but to be fair, I don't think anything would have worked to prepare you for all the weirdness to follow. So this first track is the most commercial and poppy cut of them all, with vocals from Emma Gillespie and even some trap percussion. Yeah, trap percussion. With that as your description, it sounds like kind of a bad sign, but thankfully this track is seriously catchy and very well produced, with some little dub moments and random voice samples interspersed. I was hooked on this one pretty quickly. Much like most of the tracks in the first half of The Dream, I often find myself singing along with this one. I can be with you, only in my dreams, but I'm always holding on now. Reminds me of The Truth Is in particular, a pretty desperate sounding thing. Needless to say, this album is not gonna fall for second track syndrome. Wish I Had a Pretty Dog might be a slightly better tone setter for the album, even if it probably wouldn't have worked as an opener. It's a darker kind of dramatic dub track with more voice samples and some very familiar sounding bongo patterns. They're not the same ones as those on, like, the Backside of the Moon, but I know I've heard them somewhere before. I don't know. Pretty creepy sounding, but not so serious it doesn't fit here. Kind of reminds me a little of the Dreams opener a little bit, actually. And then we get the first of our singles here, well, the second one to get released. That is Rush Hill Road. Easily the catchiest track on here, and certainly one of the most energetic Orb tracks I've heard in a while. Like it's a faster remix of Perpetual Dawn with vocals from Holly Cook. So baby, tell me what's the rush to start over? Has some cool 60s organ kind of sound too. Gives it a bit of an old school psychedelic vibe. But that's the last track with an obvious vocal feature and the point at which we start to drift away from the Dream sound and off towards earlier sounds, like Pillow Fight at Shag Mountain with Jah Wobble, which sounds like it samples part of its beat from Into the Fourth Dimension and brings in lots of pianos that give off maybe a little bit of Metallic Spheres feel in some areas. Maybe. I think it's actually Roger Eno on the piano there. He's credited on several tracks here, and on all the ones he's on, there's some really nice piano accompaniment, so yeah, his contributions are definitely cool. Anyway, the track goes at a steady pace, like a techno track, but a particularly strange techno track, if that, with a fun sample of a movie news report of an alien orb descending upon the populace. And we're wondering, oh, what's this thing gonna do? And then we get to Isle of Horns, which sounds like it sampled one section of Moon Building at one point, and overall sounds much more like a Thomas Fellman-driven track than anything before, obviously since he's on it. Besides maybe that falsetto-y mumbling voice sample placed on top. So we've delved into some much more subtle territory than we were exploring before. But this more subtle sound is interrupted by Wolfbane featuring Roni FM, the next pre-album single, and also the single's strangest track in the bunch, and probably also the one I take the most issue with. I really like the idea of the track being the most sample-driven track of them all, and kind of having this disorienting tonal clash with some serious vocal samples with other samples that are like trying to be funny, and some of which don't succeed. So fair warning on some of these samples. There's the horn blares from Young Frankenstein that I tend to associate it with that one stupid viral video of like some chipmunk looking at a camera super dramatically. That one. There's samples of Dr. Dre's The Next Episode, and exactly the one you're thinking of if you know which track I'm talking about. So, yeah, Snoop Dogg saying, "Smoke weed every day." Bit of an old punchline there, but unfortunately, there's also air horns. I can forgive the Young Frankenstein and Next Episode samples. I warmed up to them eventually, found them kind of funny after a while. But I can't excuse the air horns. We should not still be using that freaking sound effect in 2018. And that single element alone made Wolfbane my least favorite track on the album. But again, I still managed to enjoy the track's insanity. These outdated memes are juxtaposed with a voice sample describing in great detail the possible destruction caused by a nuclear bomb. Yeah, it's a weird track, and I'm not entirely sure why they picked the weirdest track on the album as the single, but whatever. I guess knowing that the outdated memes would be here at a time, I guess it's appreciated. I should mention that I do kinda also like, with going from that nuclear bomb voice sample, the entire album does have a little bit of a kinda like an apocalyptic theme to it. Albeit apocalyptic in the way of like a Doctor Strangelove kind of apocalyptic. Like that one guy who's sitting on a nuclear bomb and it's falling out of the sky and he's just like, yeah! That's the kind of vibe I get out of this album as a whole, I think, and it works alright. But anyways, going on from there, we then move on to Other Blue Worlds, which is the most subtle and stripped back track on the album, continuing as if Wolfbane never even happened in the first place. Another very Feldman-esque moon-building style track. Not much happens here, unfortunately, but I don't ever feel the urge to skip it. Good track. And we get to the last of the singles, and the first one that was actually released, Doughnuts Forever, also featuring Jah Wobble. Nice, pleasant little instrumental hip-hop kind of track, switching off between some subtly unnerving piano chords and some 40s Disney choir sample or something. Not much to this track either, but it's definitely stuck out as a highlight in my mind. Then we have an interlude, Drift, which sounds like it's also going for that peaceful, pastoral, Disney-like vibe, with some poetic princess dreamily narrating over it, talking about being hypnotized or something like that. And that leaves the last three tracks, which are all among the biggest highlights in the bunch. Easy on the Onions has quite a few elements in common with Towers of Dub, slow plodding beat, harmonica playing the melody, but it's like the movie soundtrack edition or something, with lots of piano accompaniment and an overall much slower and sadder feel than Towers of Dub. I guess the title is a reference to onions making you cry or something? It works. Certainly one of the most emotionally potent moments on the album. And then we got Ununited States, which is like a slow solo piano ballad with funeral trumpet accompaniment and the usual weird textures, again creating this really harrowing and emotional atmosphere. Actually, it reminds me a lot of certain moments from that last Spunkshine album, actually. No one's listened to. The album could end here if they wanted it to, but instead we got one last monster of a finale track, the 15-minute opus known as Soul Planet. Yay for super long extended or pieces, always game for these kinds of large-scale tracks. And boy, so much happens in this track that the entire thing just seems to zip by. Got two different, like, kinda soul singers, I think. Or maybe more, but two stuck out to me. There's this one male singer that's all over this whole thing. I think it's Andy Kane, I'm not sure. He kinda has, like, a high-pitched and laid-back voice, and he's constantly all over the track, and he's a welcome presence. And there's also Mary Pierce, who I previously only knew from Calvin Harris's Ready for the Weekend. Did not expect to be referencing that in this video. She was the highlight on that track, and she was awesome here too, doing a kind of Pink Floyd Great Gig in the Sky kind of performance here. And yeah, she's great. And the beats underneath all the singing, they go all over the place. They're mostly pretty spacey and ambient, and you got your usual NASA samples. But sometimes a steady and fast-paced techno beat comes underneath, and then goes away. I think maybe the KLF Chills Out did something like that at one point. I forget. Some album I know did that. And there's more pianos, and there's even a sample of the Roadrunner from Looney Tunes at one point, because why not? So, yeah. That's a lot to unpack. I'm not sure if I even covered everything, but I think that'd be a decent enough place to stop for individual tracks. I haven't even talked about the rest of the vocal samples placed around for texture, just like The Dream did. I've talked about the highlights and biggest standouts, but they're constantly there throughout the album, and they're much more memorable and entertaining than those on, say, the last album. This is exactly the kind of sampling that I think of when I think of Dr. Alex Patterson. I'm just so glad we got something this dense and layered out of this album. This album just goes every which way and doesn't stick to just one sound or style, obviously to be expected given the album title, but it is so much livelier and pops out at me so much more than the last couple of Orb albums too. I feel like I might have a personal ranking. It's about equal with Moonbuilding, or maybe a little higher. I still think Moonbuilding was a lot more inventive and unique than this album was. This one rehashed a lot of old stuff, and the newer stuff could be sometimes trendy. But No Sounds Are Out of Bounds is the most entertaining listening experience that's come out of the Orb in a really long time. Again, I think since The Dream. Now, I do still imagine this album is, like I said, it's probably going to be a bit of a controversial one. It does have those more modernized elements I mentioned that don't always work. Well, really the only time it bothered me was the air horns on Wolfbane, but I can see other moments turning people off. And also, if you're looking for an album that's really focused and streamlined and cohesive, this is not it. I mentioned this album is kind of a giant mess, but I don't mind how all over the place it is, because basically every track on here delivered some entertainment value for me. Even the weaker moments, like Other Blue Worlds and Wolfbane, were at least entertaining in some way. And yeah, I think that's basically all I have to say on the topic of this album. I had an absolute ton of fun listening to this thing. I've heard it like 10, 11 times now, and I'm still not sick of it. I think I'd personally rank it as a top-tier Orb album, and one of my favorite albums of the year so far, for sure. Definitely gonna make the year-end list proper. And, I'd say it's definitely worth people's time. This is the most fun I've had reviewing an album so far this year, so, I'll leave it at that. I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. Oh, God. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it. But I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. If you want to join that list or make me review something, there's a link to my Patreon in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.